Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast that explores how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. This is a special bonus episode. The next episode will be released on the 1st of the month as scheduled. Trigger warning. This episode discusses Japanese literature, which means it's going to mention suicide quite a lot, as well as child sexual abuse. Is No Longer Human about BPD? And should we even ask that question? When I studied Japanese literature for my PhD in comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, I'd meet people at parties who, when they heard my area of expertise, enthused over anime or maybe the film director Kurosawa. But most at the time hadn't read much literature from Japan. So it's been really thrilling over the past few years to see that changing. More people are reading great translations of work by contemporary writers from Japan, especially women writers like Mieko Kawakami. And it's been especially exciting to hear and see young people talking so much about Osamu Dazai's 1948 novel, No Longer Human. I see as much talk about that book as, say, a novel written in English like My Year of Rest and Relaxation, about which I wrote for Electric Literature and may do an episode on as well. Here's my disgraceful secret. I didn't read No Longer Human, Ningen Shikaku in Japanese, during grad school. Some students in my literature courses are taken aback by the thought that there's a book I haven't read, but trust me, there are many. Last week, I finally sat down and read No Longer Human. In this episode, I'm not going to reach any solid conclusions about which diagnosis or diagnoses Yozo, the first-person narrator of the bulk of No Longer Human, might have. Instead, I'm interested in the debate over whether or not we should diagnose fictional characters with mental disorders at all. I'm jumping into the fray from my perspective on No Longer Human as a Japanese literature scholar and a person with BPD, depression, and PTSD. On social media and elsewhere, people have proposed a constellation of diagnoses for Yozo, with BPD, depression, complex PTSD, and antisocial personality disorder being the most popular. The author himself died by suicide shortly after completing this novel, which features several suicide attempts. Both Yozo and Dazai seem to meet some of the contemporary criteria for BPD laid out in the 5th and latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which came out in 2013 and which are as follows. Frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, a pattern of unstable and intense relationships, unstable sense of self, impulsivity that is self-damaging, recurrent suicidal behavior or self-mutilating behavior, rapid mood swings, chronic feelings of emptiness, uncontrollable anger, stress-related paranoid ideation, or dissociative symptoms. I want to put a pin in conceiving of Dazai or Yozo as borderline based on their multiple suicide attempts and Dazai's completed suicide, even though that's the flashing red light in this list of symptoms when it comes to No Longer Human. For now, I just want to say that in the 1940s, when Dazai published this novel, the term borderline did already exist, but it was sort of a floating signifier used for patients, often women, whom clinicians found difficult. And the next time the DSM is updated, the criteria above may be radically altered. Diagnoses are constantly shifting sands, which is one problem with trying to use a contemporary diagnosis to illuminate a fictional character written over 75 years ago. Recently, I interviewed Dr. Merri Lisa Johnson, author of Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, Memoir of a Borderline Personality, for episodes of A Real Affliction that will be released this fall. She's an incredibly talented writer and scholar who draws on gender studies, disability studies and lived experience with BPD in her very exciting creative and academic work. At one point in our interview, she told me that she's very interested in identifying BPD traits in literary characters, but she admitted that this practice is controversial. My talk with Lisa got me thinking about that. I realized that it's strange that understanding characters through the framework of contemporary medical diagnoses is discouraged by some, yet understanding literary text through psychoanalytic concepts is not discouraged at all. In fact, I had to study Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan while pursuing a literature doctorate at Berkeley. That's pretty arbitrary. Why is it okay to analyze literature through the spyglass of Freud's concepts of mourning and melancholia, or the uncanny, or the pleasure principle, or to explore it through Lacan's formulation of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, but it's not okay to read a book and say that the protagonist has BPD? That question, that weirdness, inspired this episode. I should clarify that in talking about diagnosing fictional characters, I'm not referring to characters like Rebecca Bunch from the television series Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, whose diagnosis is central to the narrative. I don't think anyone would debate that BPD is the structuring principle for her character and that whole series. I should also explain that I'm not going to wade into the even thornier debate about diagnosing real people, particularly U.S. presidential candidates with mental disorders. The Goldwater rule proscribes psychiatrists from diagnosing patients whom they have not personally evaluated. However, during Trump's presidency, some psychiatrists broke with this rule and justified it by saying that the exigency of Trump's enormous power made it allowable for experts to suggest that he might not be mentally stable. On the we shouldn't diagnose fictional characters side, writer and William Blake scholar Shirley Dent argued against reading fictional characters' behaviors through the lens of autism in an article for The Guardian titled, "Don't Diagnose Fictional Characters." She writes, quote, "Characters as diverse as the monster from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to Sherlock Holmes have been placed on the autistic spectrum. Does this help us understand the books better? I'm afraid not. Having a neat medical tick box in which to place a character and understand them detracts from, rather than adds to, what the story is trying to tell us," end quote. She gives the example of Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville, which, curiously, Mary Lisa Johnson also discusses in Girl in Need of a Tourniquet. Dent argues that Melville's story about an odd office clerk who answers orders with the refrain, "I would prefer not to," is as much about an alienating society as it is about an alienated character. And bestowing a diagnosis of autism on Bartleby doesn't change that fact. It may even make it harder to see, she says. On the opposing side, clinical psychologist Jared Fife writes in Psychology Today, quote, "Diagnosing fictional characters is fun because people love good fictional characters, allows the public to learn about mental illnesses, which they may or may not have, and offers opportunities for psychologists to feel smart and get public recognition. Everybody wins, except for the fictional characters who might get a bad reputation, but they don't have their feelings hurt by such discussions." That last sentence is revealing. It implies that Fife admits to certain diagnoses carrying stigma and potentially resulting in a bad reputation. But then, if you're listening to this podcast, you already know that there are. In fact, one of the reasons I'm doing it is because of clinician stigma against BPD. But I do agree with him that diagnosing fictional characters can be educating and entertaining. He's also correct that Freud did it too. He mentions that Freud used the fictional character of Oedipus in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex to construct his theory of the Oedipal complex. However, there's a more significant benefit to diagnosing fictional characters, in my opinion. In a peer-reviewed article published in January 2024, Craig Klugman and Carol Levine describe how they diagnosed Shosha, a recurring character in the work of Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer, who detailed Polish Jewish communities right before they were exterminated by the Nazis. They argue that this exercise can provide them with better understanding of our current world and the social determinants of health, which include income, education, job security, built environments like housing, and food security. Quote, although the practice of diagnosing the past is controversial, by examining a historico-fictional person rooted in a particular period, we engage in a unique health humanities exercise of health and social justice studies, end quote. After diagnosing Shosha with celiac disease, they conclude, quote, this exercise offers lessons for current scholars and all of us as observers of a modern world facing increasingly violent threats of anti-Semitism and fascism, that personal health and well-being is affected deeply by the social determinants in which we live, some of which we can control and most of which we cannot. These are lessons the Holocaust offers that we are at risk of forgetting. I do agree with that. I also agree with Klugman and Levine that diagnosing fictional characters who live in worlds that feel so real to us can awaken us to insights about the historical past and our present. Interestingly, both Shosha in Singer's work and Yozo in No Longer Human were characters grappling with health problems in the context of rising fascism, as are all readers who encounter No Longer Human today. So what would diagnosing Yozo teach us about the environment in which he lived and suffered, and what does it teach us about our own? First, I'd like to give some background about Dazai and the form in which No Longer Human is written. Dazai was considered one of the Japanese decadents, called the Buraiha in Japanese. He is probably most famous among Japanese critics for The Setting Sun, a 1947 novel that chronicled a ruined aristocratic family after World War II. The characters in this novel, like Dazai and everyone around him, had been rocked by the loss of the war, the emperor's renunciation of his divinity in a radio speech, occupation by the United States, and the firebombing of Tokyo, not to mention the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These circumstances affected the writing of No Longer Human the following year as well. Japanese scholar Carol Fisher Sorgenfrey suggests that No Longer Human, quote, may be seen as a metaphor for the position of Japan after the war, self-hatred, and a sense of not belonging to the human race, of being both a monster and a victim, certainly suggests the national questing for identity and for understanding the past. The outcast does not know how to leave the margins and fails to comprehend his own reversibility, end quote. Much more than we can appreciate when we read the novel in 2024 outside of Japan, Dazai's life, death, and work had political undertones to contemporaries, given that he'd briefly been a Marxist at a time when that was radical and dangerous, and then renounced it. These readings beg the question, if they could read his life, death, and work through politics, why can't we come to terms with No Longer Human through contemporary medical diagnoses? I would say that one complication with doing so is the form itself. Dazai uses the form of watashi shosetsu, usually translated as I novel, and that's capital letter I, first person pronoun I. In Edward Fowler's book about this form, titled The Rhetoric of Confession, he argues that the watashi shosetsu is fundamentally different from the Western novel, so that the term I novel is misleading. He also reminds us that there are a lot of different words for I in Japanese. At least for men there are. Women have fewer options. Which first-person pronoun the man chooses depends on his relationship with the person he's addressing. In this way, the self in Japanese is defined relationally. It is an inherently slippery I that we encounter in this so-called I novel. Fowler also claims that watashi shosetsu offer rhetorical performances of sincerity, not truly sincere confessions, as many critics have believed. Nearly all renowned early 20th century Japanese writers experimented with this form. The I in the watashi shosetsu is often withdrawn from society, like Yozo is, which goes much against the grain of the standard social order in Japan at that time. Even in earlier canonical Japanese literature, Japanese protagonists are often powerless to a great extent, accepting the transience and sorrows of life, making Yozo an anomaly in terms of degree more than actions or temperament. While it is part of this native tradition, No Longer Human could also be seen as a Japanese Catcher in the Rye, complete with an unreliable, disaffected narrator. The novel is structured as a frame story, meaning that its book ended by commentary from someone who was given the journals of this madman by a mutual friend 7 years after the events described in the narrative, which seemed to take place in the 1930s. Who is Yozo, this madman? He's sickly, he was sexually abused as a child by his parents' servants, and he suffers greatly from shame. He seeks to please others as a child by acting like a clown. His intrusive thoughts could signify obsessive-compulsive disorder. He dreams of a violent death, which is less surprising when we consider the environment he would have grown up in during the 1930s, when Japan was immured in fascism. Fascism glorifies the deaths of beautiful young people, especially in sacrifice to the nation. Yozo is intimidated by everything from talking to sales clerks to riding a streetcar. He's perpetually gloomy and suicidal. When he and his lover try to drown themselves, she dies and he survives, just like a woman with whom Dazai tried to die. I should say, like one of the women with whom Dazai tried to die. There were several. After he recuperates from his suicide in the hospital, Yozo is picked up by the police for being involved. He's subsequently so depressed that he has lost the energy even to think of suicide. He's riddled with insomnia. He lies compulsively. He abuses alcohol. There's tons of self-medicating throughout the novel. At one point, he even trades a kiss for morphine. He has ugly affairs, he says, to compound his shame. After his wife is sexually assaulted, he tries to die by sleeping pills. Near the end of the novel, he's taken to the male wing in an insane asylum. There, he refuses medicine, the first time he's ever said no. He's let out a few months later after his disapproving father's death, and his brothers set him up in a house in the country, a kind of gentle exile outside of Tokyo. 3 years go by, and he seems to revert to his extreme passivity, commenting that he is sometimes violated by his 60-year-old servant. Despite his antics, the novel ends with a woman describing Yozo as an angel. There are strong parallels between Dazai and his character. Yozo attempts double suicide, and Dazai actually attempted double suicide multiple times before his final attempt, which resulted in the deaths of both himself and his lover a few months after finishing the novel. Dazai was also hospitalized and abused alcohol and drugs. He also went through a Marxist phase like Yozo and was disowned by his parents. Despite these autobiographical echoes, the prominence of Shinju, or love suicide, in Japanese literature complicates viewing Yozo through the lens of BPD. I spoke about this tradition in more detail in an essay called Suicide, Contagion, and the Risks of Literature. If you're interested, I put a link to it in the episode comments. But in summary, suicide in the form of love suicide and seppuku, which refers to ritual suicide by samurai, had been a trope in Japanese literature and art for hundreds of years by the time that Dazai wrote No Longer Human. It appears in countless long and short fictional works, puppet plays, film, and other media. One of the most famous Japanese writers to talk about suicide was Yukio Mishima, with whom Dazai is sometimes aligned because of the elements of zankoku nobi, or the aesthetic of cruelty, that can be found in the work of both. Mishima's novels abound with suicide, especially his final works, his tetralogy, The Sea of Fertility. And on November 25th, 1970, 45-year-old Mishima took over the Tokyo headquarters of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, essentially the army of a country whose national military had been abolished by fiat, with a devoted group of followers, and after speechifying to jeering soldiers, committed seppuku, but I'll spare you the exact details. In my opinion, Yozo's suicide attempts could be read as much as a symptom of a literary tradition as a symptom of mental illness were it not for Dazai's own history. Of course, we could follow the principle outlined in Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author essay, which insists that the author's intent just doesn't matter. Even if Dazai put suicides into No Longer Human, simply to emulate a Japanese literary tradition, we readers can disregard this intent and perceive Yozo as having BPD. Even if he put them in because he himself was drawn to love suicide, we could ignore his intent again and interpret it as an allusion to a much older tradition in the Japanese canon. Dazai's personal history doesn't really get us far in attempting to diagnose his character. But what might we lose in labeling Yozo with BPD or depression or antisocial personality disorder? I think that the danger is always that we might reduce the diagnosis to a caricature if we're talking about a fictional character with someone who doesn't have much personal experience with the disorder. We don't have the years of getting to know fictional characters as we do with our friends, family members, and coworkers, so the events in their plotline loom very large for us. So if we simply point to Yozo and say he must have BPD, the person listening to us, they don't know much about BPD, might assume that everyone with that disorder attempts double love suicide or is afraid to ride public transportation. However, I do think this risk is fairly low. There's a reason that I'm interested in opening up a space for diagnosing fictional characters with mental disorders. It's related to my extreme interest in narrative medicine, which I believe is one way to intervene with clinician stigma against certain conditions. In the year 2000, Rita Charan, who's an internist and has a PhD in English, developed narrative medicine along with other scholars. It's a multidisciplinary approach that teaches close reading of literature and creative writing to health workers in order to help them to better listen, attend, and respond to their patients' stories. In fact, I'm trying to convince the two universities I teach at to add narrative medicine courses to their curricula because I believe it will increase the number of clinicians who are willing to work with patients who have historically been considered difficult, BPD patients foremost among them. That, in turn, will almost certainly save lives. So stories like No Longer Human, if we allow them to, could become test cases as narrative medicine students try to figure out how they might best support the well-being of a character like Yozo. In addition, I think that diagnosing fictional characters actually helps us to realize that mental disorders like BPD can be situated on a spectrum. We all have some minor BPD traits when you think about it. Everyone loses, well, I should say almost everyone loses control of their emotions at some point in their life. Almost everyone feels empty. But when we look at a character like Yozo and say, okay, he's making some questionable decisions, but maybe he at least has some traits of BPD, depression, and complex PTSD. And by putting that light diagnosis on him, we might be able to feel some sympathy and even empathy for his self-destructive actions. We might acknowledge that, yes, he would probably be a difficult person to be in a relationship with, but he was sexually abused as a child, and he's doing the best he can to cope with it. And in this situation, he is similar to many people with BPD and complex PTSD who have been abused during childhood. Ultimately, I think that the debate over diagnosing fictional characters should actually be a gentle reminder of the risks of actually diagnosing family members, partners, lovers, and friends with mental disorders without real proof. Unless we have experience in psychiatry, psychology, social work, or a related field, and this person is our client, we're not in a position to give them a diagnosis. If we really want to diagnose someone, why not just go do it to our favorite fictional character? And at the same time, we might be able to find tenderness for the struggle of the people in our lives through reading about similar actions or personality traits in literature. In fact, I believe that one of the most magnificent gifts of literature is that it may help us to look upon others with greater tenderness. What's remarkable is that even while it's informed by a unique sociocultural context and literary tradition, the English version of No Longer Human strikes a chord with so many readers today. While I don't know if anything could have really made him happy, Dazai, I believe, would at least have been intrigued by the wild success of this work in the book talk age. Thank you for listening. I'll be releasing my next episode on August 1st. As usual, I release episodes on the 1st and 15th of the month. The next episode will feature an interview with powerhouse BPD advocate Melanie Goldman, aka the fabulous Mind Over Melanie. Have a wonderful day. Take care.